Hello, Pod Smashers of the Internet, and welcome to another episode of
Bit Pod Smash. Termite's back.
Termite's Back, where gaming goes to grab a beer.
Oh, I didn't have mine ready.
Oh, you slacker.
Yep.
Ooh, that sounded like the intro to Foghat, Lowrider. Anyway, we are a weekly video game podcast, smashing together ideas that you care about with video games.
That's right, and tonight we are going to be talking about the Xbox One, its history, its specifications, just everything about that console as part of our Soul in the Consoles series of podcast episodes. And yeah, we follow kind of a fairly rigid outline. I've been doing this for a couple of episodes now. We did all the Sega consoles, and we've done almost all except this one of the Xbox consoles. So this will be the last one, and then we can move on to another manufacturer. So whether that's going to be Nintendo or Sony or something else, Atari maybe, who knows? We haven't decided
Maybe
yet.
our audience could help us determine what they want to hear about.
I kind of wouldn't hate doing like the Nintendo handheld line first.
Yes, I would love to do that.
Before the Nintendo like home consoles. I think I would like to do the handhelds. That would be fun. So anyways, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. In the meantime, we are going to finish strong with the Microsoft consoles, the Microsoft line, and do that. So anyways, we'll get more into that as we go. Did we say that we're Penguin and Termite? I'm Penguin and he's Termite.
I am Termite.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah,
where gaming goes to grab a beer.
We definitely did that part because we tanked or whatever. But anyways, that's what we're gonna talk about, and we will get to that and more. But in the meantime, we are where gaming goes to grab a beer. So let's talk about what we're drinking tonight.
Really quickly, you and Java Fiend did a wonderful job in my absence. I listened to the whole episode on the way home from our vacation, and it was wonderful to listen to. So, mythology, deep dive, there were some things that I was like, or you could do this. And then you said it, and I was like, hey, I feel like I was a part of the show. Or Java Fiend said it. I don't remember the details. Right. But it was wonderful. So thanks, Java Fiend, again, for chipping in for me while I was away. Mm-hmm. Our life has been turned upside down by lots of events. You, namely, having a second child.
Yes.
I won't speak all for you. You could have more going on in your life. Myself, because of many, many work trips that I have taken back to back, that has pulled me away from regular recording to do our backup episodes, and now I'm in the throngs of moving and uplifting our entire family of four to move an hour and a half away. So we're in the middle of packing and trying to get our house together to look appropriate to sell. It's a whole thing. So thank you, Java Fiend, for stepping in a massive crunch, unlike anything we've seen yet over the last 4 years of doing this podcast. In fact, tonight is episode 210.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we've never missed a beat.
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, and it was like, in the past when we've had sort of upheaval, we had been able to sort of predict it and bank episodes accordingly. In fact, just in general, we used to bank a lot more episodes than we do now. And we got kind of complacent over COVID because it became really easy to get in the routine of just like record one night, have a week to edit and then get it out by Sunday. But that's becoming increasingly difficult with our circumstances. So we're going to work on banking some episodes so that we don't have to run into a circumstance. Although part of me is tempted to be like, well, now you get to do an episode alone with a guest star. But maybe we hold that in our back pocket for an emergency situation. So be thinking about who you would want to call in case of some kind of emergency or circumstance in which we'd have to do that. But all right, well, let's not waste any more of our precious time, and let's talk about what we're drinking tonight.
Oh, I don't know if I've talked about this beer this year. I don't think I have. But when I went to Ocean City, another trip that I took, that was not a work trip, that was a fun trip. I went to Dogfish Head proper. I went actually to the brewery with T-Bone. The first time he'd ever been there. It was close enough to detour. It was super fun. It was awesome. It may have even been my favorite thing. But I picked up a lot of, 24-pack of pumpkin ale from Dogfish Head, and that is what I'm drinking tonight. One of those. Every year, it does come out around this time, and it does taste a little different every year, but it has always been by far my favorite pumpkin beer. They call it punkin, like the punk rock pumpkin ale, and it is a brown ale brewed with pumpkin and spices. So it's not a spiced beer or a flavored beer. It's actually brewed with those things in the mix, in the mash. And I've always felt, to me, this beer was a more authentic take on what a pumpkin beer should be versus like a brown ale that's added at the back end of like artificial flavors or like sweetened to be cinnamon and nutmeg and such. This actually is a pumpkin beer, and it's a brown ale.
Yeah, the pumpkin is part of the process from the beginning. So yeah, it makes sense. Cool.
Delicious. Quality.
I'm drinking another one of my wood boogers because, like you said, life is hard right now. Not hard. Life is just complicated right now, and so it's hard to get out and get interesting beers. So, drinking my wood booger from, what do you call it? Strange Ways, and I talked about it last week, so I don't need to go into detail, but nice brown ale.
I liked Ryan's idea about playing a Friday the 13th game where someone is Sasquatch or Woodburger. That'd be great.
Yeah, it's definitely a fall flavory kind of beer, though. The brown ale, nice and crisp, and I didn't really hit on that last week, so that's what I'll hit on, is just how much this reminded me of fall. It's kind of great because even though we're still 85, 90 degree weather here in Virginia in late September, as we approach the equinox, I'm still getting kind of like in a fall mood because the days are getting shorter, so it looks more like fall out there. And you see all the fall stuff in the store, right? Like I saw the Halloween candy was out when I went to the grocery store last time. I was like, oh my gosh, Halloween's coming up. And I grabbed some apple. They didn't have lemonade, which we've been kind of drinking all summer. So I grabbed some apple cider, and I'm like, ooh, apple cider. And I got pumpkin creamer for our coffee. So I'm like, all right, I'm starting to adjust into like fall mood. I just hope the weather catches up to my expectations.
Can't wait. Yes.
So, nice. All right. Well, we can fill this time talking about some stuff. So and did you have anything in mind to talk about until we move to our segments?
I do want to address on our newscast last week, we announced that our Twitch presence is dissolving until December, where we'll come back. So
not
given the
just
early,
pause.
That's true. Put it on pause.
Button. Yeah,
little hiatus.
Yep.
We're going to take a break from our Twitch streaming. The live stuff is a lot more pressure on us both, and given our most uncertain lifetime situation, it's impossible for us to meet a schedule and commit to it right now without severely inconveniencing the more important things in our life, like family, childhood, and work, and childcare, I should say, and work, and all those things. So we're going to prioritize those aspects of our lives for this phase of life, and we are going to come back to Twitch strong in December. We're going to try to time a revival around the Game Awards. Maybe we do a double live stream watch-along or something fun. We don't have those plans or details worked out yet, but just letting our audience know our podcast will stay the same. We will stay the course. We will always release an episode on Mondays, every single Monday, unless you hear otherwise, but we've never missed an episode.
Of the universe, we are working very hard every day to achieve immortality so we can be here forever doing a podcast forever.
Well, they say that you actually die twice. The first time you physically die. The second time is the last person that mentions your name. So as long as our stuff exists on the internet somewhere, immortality is at hand.
Ours. I love it. Anyways, cool. All right. Well, that is.
And one more thing. Okay, I want to knock on your episode with Ryan, Java Fiend, that you didn't mention The Witcher 3. In that they borrowed. Did you?
I 100% did.
How? In what way?
We brought up because Java Fiend / Ryan, he brought up how he would be interested in like Slavic mythology.
Oh, the Three Witches.
Yeah, well, he was talking about the Baba Yaga or whatever, and I said
that's Tomb Raider.
Yeah, I did mention Tomb Raider, but I also mentioned Baba Yaga is like a Slavic, like Eastern European kind of that area mythology, and I mentioned that I am, again. The Witcher is Polish, which is in that area of Eastern Europe. And I said, so The Witcher was not based on, or it was not directly based, it was not directly adapting mythology, but it was heavily inspired by Slavic mythology. So I did mention The Witcher 3.
Okay, cool. All right, sweet. Yep, I stand corrected. All right. I must have missed that somehow. I don't know how I missed that, but okay.
Yeah,
I'll take your word for it.
I brought it up. I know it, because I know we talked about it in the context of Slavic mythology. So.
Nice. Yeah. Cool. All right, cool. That's it. Now we can move on to the next segment of our show, which is doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Favorite thing.
My mind went blank for a second there. Wow. I'm going to have to leave that in there now. Normally I cut out like that out, especially really loud ones, but that one is perfect.
Yeah, it's
totally
priceless.
Encapsulated what was happening in my brain at that moment.
And we switched roles because you usually do that to me, and this time it was great.
It's funny. Yep.
Cool.
All right, Favorite Things is a segment of our show where we share with you something that we are excited about, something that we are digging, that we've discovered or experienced, or that interested us or caught our eye, that has got us thinking or musing or emoting or whatever verb you want to choose. It has sparked something in us this week, and we want to share that with you in hopes that you go out and try to find your next favorite thing that elicits those feelings in you. So, do you want to start?
Sure. I went on vacation last week to Emerald Isle, North Carolina, where I spent a week at the beach with my parents and my T-Bone and my wife and kids. That's not my favorite thing, because that was a mixed bag of fun and relaxation and lots of tension among who's going to take care of the kids at any given moment, and lots of everyone wanting pockets of freedom and relaxation with knowing that there are children to take care of and a not-so-child-proof home. It was very hectic. So what I am going to glean as my favorite thing out of that trip was I finished Jason Schreier's second book called Press Reset. That is my favorite thing. I hope and dream that you could read this book and that we could do an entire podcast episode about it. But it's all about the craziness, the inconsistencies of the video game industry, studios that stand up and shut down on a dime. And I'll use one story as a specific to hold as an example of what the book kind of does, because it does stand out to me. There was a Red Sox player. He was a pitcher. His name is Curt Schilling. You may have heard of him. He made a lot of headlines and got a lot of trouble on the news lately. He got fired from ESPN, etc. But he stood up a studio called Studio 38, and he had no video game experience whatsoever, and he poured $100+ million of his own money from his time playing baseball for the Red Sox into the studio, dumping into lavishing on his employees and allowing them to have these crazy, extravagant lifestyles in their offices with all the catering and all the food and all the crazy technology and expensive laptops to work on, trying to deliver a World of Warcraft killer back in the 2008 timeframe. An example of what happens when people like this get a hold of a company and they hire hundreds and hundreds of people. One of those people owned a house in Massachusetts, and this company had to move to Rhode Island because the governor of Rhode Island, a Republican, had driven the economic success to the ground. There was none. And they needed a lifeline. So Curt Schilling's company, Studio 38, was that potential lifeline. So he moved his company to Rhode Island and sought a government loan of $75 million to add to his company that was bankrupt already from his own. And so that's the first warning sign. One of the employees who owned a house in Massachusetts was upside down on his house, owed more than it was worth, could not sell it, but the company had his back. Sure, we got you. We will sell your home. We'll buy it from you. You can sell it and move to Rhode Island. So he does. He continues to work at Studio 38. Studio 38 also bought a subsidiary company called Big Huge Games, which published your favorite game. No, it's not really, but Kingdoms of Amalur. Of Amalur, the only game ever released under the Studio 38 umbrella. So that was related. That was in Maryland. Side story. I go back to this house. This guy moved his entire family to Rhode Island to only be a victim of a moronic leader who had no business running a video game studio. The entire hundreds of employees all laid off because they found out because they didn't have paychecks in their bank. That was how they found out. The studio shut down because we didn't get paid. And they got to work and they had announcements and it went to the crap. That house was then defaulted on by Studio 38's loan, and so it went back to the man who thought he was free and clear of this upside down house, completely ruined his entire financial future. And so the book just goes account by account by account of developers who work for various studios that have been shut down at a whim, and has completely changed my tune on unionization in video games, and which we had an episode about where I was not for unionization in video games, but now I think I kind of am. And this book changed that tune. So sorry, it was a little bit long. I think I went like 2 or 3 minutes describing that one story, but that's just a tease for what the book has. An entire novel of various stuff. Irrational Games, who made BioShock Infinite, is another story that they walk through in that studio that got shut down. Visceral Games under EA, who did Dead Space, they got shut down. So the book just goes through. Jason Schreier is amazing. He did all of his journalistic awesomeness with this book. So it documents, chronicles all of those things over years, and I want you to read it. I want to do a show on the podcast about it, entirely about the video game industry and it's how it works. So there it is. That's my favorite thing.
Sweet. Yeah, I would love to check into it. I've got the other book, I think, of his, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, or I have some book. I have some book of his.
That's the only other one he's ever wrote. He's got two.
Or maybe not some book of his. I've got another book, and I don't know if it was his or not, but I want to read it. So
Yeah.
I saw it in my drawer, and I was like, oh crap, I need to put that on my shelf so I know that so it's somewhere I can see it so I can read it. But
yeah,
cool. It's probably a tiny book compared to the stuff I normally read. So when
it's a very fast read. I finished the whole thing in 1 week. So
yeah, there you go. So cool. So my favorite thing. This is tough because I don't like to. At this point, it's hard to use the word terminology favorite. So I'll caveat by just simply saying the thing I'm about to describe is not like a good thing or an interest, or not. Sorry, it's not a good thing. It's not something that's like, ooh, yay, this is exciting. But it is an interesting thing. It's really intriguing, and it's definitely got my mind thinking, which is part of the reason why I brought that up in our intro to favorite things. Is favorite things could be something that just really got you. Pulled you in and got your mind working or whatever. So the thing that I'm going to talk about is the have you heard of the Gabby Petito case?
I have no. What's this?
Okay, so this is a girl who went missing.
It's happening now.
It's happening now. She went missing in Wyoming. Her and her fiance. So she was trying to jumpstart, kick off a van life blog. Van life is a vlog, I should say. Van life is it's kind of like a genre where these young people, they live out of a van for a long time. They go travel the country and live out of a van or whatever. And so she's trying to start that. And so that her and her fiance went on a road trip across the country. And she went missing in Wyoming. They were on their way to Yellowstone. So that was their next destination. And people knew they were going to Yellowstone. She was checking in with her friends and stuff. And she went missing. And then her boyfriend showed back up at their home in Florida alone with the van. And she was nowhere to be found. And her family, that was September 1st. And then her family filed a missing persons case on September 11th. So 10 days later, presumably they'd been trying to get a hold of him or her. And she was completely missing and he was AWOL. And so they finally filed a missing persons case. And then he was not cooperating with the police. And then he disappeared. So his family filed a missing persons case a few days ago. And so he's missing again. Missing, quote unquote. He's missing or hiding. The most recent thing that kind of happened was they did find her body. So she is dead, unfortunately. And so I caveat by saying it's a terrible, horrible thing that happened to her. My thoughts and prayers, of course, go out to the family, and I feel so terrible for that family down in Florida. But the case...
Was this the story with the police body cam footage of the couple that was fighting?
They'd been fighting a few days before she went missing, and...
Oh, that boyfriend did it.
Yeah, no, he
totally did it.
No, he 100% did it. Not 100%. I mean, the only other explanation for his behavior is that an accident happened, and he, because of the context leading up to it, he thought that they're going to think that I did it, so I'm going to try to so I'm going to act suspiciously. I don't know again, you can't really get in the logic of someone who's panicking like that, but at the same, or panicking or crazy like that, but at the same time, I can sort of see the rationale of being people aren't going to believe me anyway, so I'm just going to get out of Dodge, or whatever. So but no, he's acting super sus, and it's so interesting. So again, there's the empathetic part of me that's I would feel terrible in that circumstance, a parent's worst nightmare, and I feel so bad for their family. But at the same time, this is not someone I know. This does not directly impact me. So from sort of an armchair detective point of view, it's really interesting story. It's a true crime podcast that's happening right now. You can follow it, and people have their theories and their ideas, and internet sleuthing is a double-edged sword. So I will simply once again caveat that by saying sometimes people on Reddit or on the internet, when they start investigating this kind of stuff, take it too far. So do not condone or get behind that. It's best to keep this as impersonal as possible when you're interested in this kind of thing. But it is really fascinating that this is happening live. So again, I don't like saying it's my favorite thing, but it is definitely the thing that has been most interesting to me over the last few days or so. I just stumbled across the whole case a couple days ago, and I'm obsessed with it. I was wow, this is interesting.
Yeah, I have a coworker who's actually on vacation right now, hiking in the very wilderness that she turned up missing in.
Wow.
And that was not she had planned that trip forever ago.
Yeah.
And so they're doing that. I wonder how that area is affected by it. I'll have to talk to her when she gets back.
Well, the county or the city, the police officers that are investigating the Wyoming side of it, it's Moab County, I think, and a murder of two homosexual women were like happened like a few months ago. They were basically found in their campsite, shot to death, and they
In
had
the same
been, like,
place?
in the same area, the same general area, and they had been like basically they had told their like the last communication that I think their friends had with them. They were saying that there was some creepy guy that was like following them and stalking them, and they even said, if we go missing, it's because we were murdered.
Oh my gosh.
It's crazy. It's another crazy story that just happened this last year. And so there was an investigation early to see if there was a link. Like maybe the same person who killed them, like, came after this couple, and then the boyfriend was so scared, whatever, that he kept his mouth shut when he got back, like so traumatized, maybe. But like they found, the police investigated it, and they said publicly that they found no link between the two cases. Therefore, again,
terrifying,
two completely separate cases, but like
it's some Twin Peaks going on up there, I'm telling you.
Yeah, seriously. Anyways, so that is that. I think that I kind of want to skip DLC if that's okay with you, because I don't really have something. I was gonna wing it anyways. I went so hard with DLC last week with Ryan.
That was fun. I enjoyed that.
That was a fun one. That I'm like, oh man, my creative juices are all spent. So yeah, let's go. We both kind of got to talk a little bit longer about our favorite things. So I would definitely, if you're interested in true crime, or if you listen to any true crime shows, that kind of podcast is super popular. I definitely recommend checking out this case. It's really interesting. It's really intriguing for people who have a mind for that kind of thing, and again, don't get personally involved in it or personally affected by it.
Yeah, I only know about it what like people have talked to me about. Like I said, I mentioned the cop body cam footage. My wife was telling me about that stuff. So yeah, it's hard to process those things and like read about it, and I can't even, especially as a parent, like,
yeah, no, there's definitely a sort of a double mind I have about it, because on the one hand I do empathize and I do feel, and I definitely feel that fear that those parents feel, that anger those parents probably feel. The boyfriend's parents totally, like, they totally helped him escape or whatever. Like, they totally hid him and dodged for him and everything. He probably told them that he killed her or whatever, or he told them what happened undoubtedly, and then they've been covering for him ever since, basically. And if I were the girl's parents, I would I don't know what I would do. I would certainly be thinking about doing some very dark things, is what I'll say, if it were my kids, because that's messed up. So, but yeah, so like on the one hand, there's all those feelings, and on the other hand, there's the sort of intellectual mind or whatever that's like, oh, this is interesting from just a sheer murder mystery standpoint, in the same way that a Sherlock Holmes or an Agatha Christie novel is interesting, even though the subject material is dark and disturbing. So, I don't know. Whatever. I'm weird. But yeah,
it's good. All right.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, that's favorite things. So that moves us on to, no, I guess we're skipping DLC.
Actual content.
I would still like to go meow, 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 meow. That is our intro to our next, or typically what our next segment, but let's go ahead and skip it. So since we got to talk about our favorite things, and we're going to move into our main topic, which is talking Soul in the console, Xbox One. So we're going to go through some kind of major sections here, which I'll describe. We're going to talk about the history of the console. How did this thing come to be? We'll talk about the hardware specifications. What is the console from just a sheer technical standpoint? We'll talk about some of the controller and attachments, accessories, and stuff like that. And we'll talk about how those things are innovative or our opinions on them. And then finally, we will talk about the kinds of games that were definitive for it and its impact and legacy as a system. So, we'll start at the beginning. We'll start at the very best place to start, which is how did this console come to be? What happened leading up to the development of the Xbox One?
Sure. And I always want to cite this book that actually inspired this entire series. It's called The Game Console, A Photographic History from Atari to Xbox, written by Evan Amos. So if you're on Amazon, check it out. It's a hardback, wonderful coffee table book to throw down, and it does document all of the video game consoles in detail. So there's a small little synopsis about what the Xbox One is, and I'm going to read that. The Xbox One was Microsoft's follow-up to its successful Xbox 360 console. Microsoft introduced the Xbox One as an all-in-one entertainment system that focused on live TV, media streaming, and social media. just as much as gaming. The new direction alienated gamers, which, combined with confusing anti-consumer policies, such as the banning of used games, all of which were dropped before launch, took a heavy toll on the Xbox brand's popularity. While the Xbox One eventually regained lost ground in the US with aggressive price drops and a renewed focus on gaming, the system never recovered abroad, where it was vastly outsold by the PlayStation 4.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful little synopsis paragraph about it before we dive into the history. I've got lots more resources to discuss.
Sure. Yeah, this one's a little... we're entering the stage in the history of video game consoles where there's the development of the consoles themselves sort of is following a kind of predictable timeline, right? Like everyone knew the next Xbox and the next PlayStation were coming, the years that they were coming. So the years they were announced, 2013, I guess, is when the unveiling was.
Yep. Yeah.
They knew that they were going to be unveiled in E3 that summer, and they were going to be released that fall. So there wasn't like I don't know, like, when we've done some of these other ones, it was sort of like, oh yeah, they were working on this and they were inspired by this, like that. This is much more of a sort of solidified, like it's happening, it's going to happen, and it's probably going to have these technologies in it. Was kind of what everyone sort of expected from it. What is different about this one, and what's I think interesting about this one, is the history really kicks off when we talk about this unveiling that happened and the features they did announce when they finally got around to it, because as you hinted at, it was troubled when it first was launched because of the direction that Microsoft wanted to take it. So yeah, basically let's talk about the Xbox 720.
Yeah, this is hilarious. So the Xbox 360 did a wonderful job in the previous generation. They started off strong. They really drove home like what Xbox Live could do. They introduced the achievement system, which then turned into what we know as trophies, and on Steam there's achievements, etc. So the Xbox 360 was super innovative, super successful, with one of the best, arguably the best controller that ever existed. Some people still stand by that controller today. The super online connectivity, and then from a publisher and developer like industry perspective, you had all of the DLC content being added and the kind of the grandfather of microtransactions, with like Oblivion having the horse thing you could buy, and the whole like Xbox point system. Like Microsoft really did a great job. Also Xbox Live Arcade and the indie movement all happened on the 360. So they had something absolutely incredible and groundbreaking and earth-shattering. Like they were ubiquitous.
Had they followed up with the 360 with something equally as successful in all those areas, then we could be looking at a very different landscape for what the gaming industry would look like at this point in history.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what happened.
No. So in 2013, like there was the rise of the smart TV, and a lot of streaming platforms were taking off. Like Netflix was doing its thing, and we had all like the advent of Hulu and Amazon Prime, and like all these things. Lots of internet connected media in general, as well as like we had smartphones that we could talk into and like do commands by voice. And so Microsoft thought,
you had the smartphone, right? Like I want to zoom in on that point because it helps explain this console and what they were trying to do with it. Everything down to its stupid name. You're right there. This console was like this. One could argue the start of the Xbox One's, like the origin of it, the apple in the eye of Microsoft, was the iPhone, right? Like the iPhone came out in 2007, I think. And from then on, basically those next 6 years, basically there was this completely changed, flipped the world on its head in regards to what was capable with mobile technology. And now everybody wanted everything on their phone because they all had smartphones, and it blew up. I remember smartphones. I remember when they first came out, I was like, I don't want that. And then like my cell phone carrier forced me to get one, basically, because they were like, we don't have any other options. They're all smartphones. I was like, whatever. And then, there's no turning back once you get it. Like once you get it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah. And that's, it was an all-in-one. That's basically what it was. It was an all-in-one device. You had your calendar, you had your email, you had text messages, you had your phone, you had the internet, you had games, you had TV, Netflix, whatever. You could get it all. It was all in your pocket, on you at all times, and just completely flip the world upside down. Microsoft chased that with their Xbox console. And so, hence the name Xbox One. They, when 2013 came around, they unveiled this console that they were hoping would become your next all-in-one device. What you did everything on, watch sports on, watched TV on, played music from, gamed from, whatever. That is what they were trying to do with the Xbox One, and hence again, one could argue that they, were basically naming it the Xbox All-in-One. So they weren't trying to because people up to that point had called the original Xbox, they'd called it the Xbox One. That was a colloquial, name for that thing for basically the better part of a decade. And here Microsoft was like Xbox One, but not one as in the first, one as in all-in-one.
Yep.
And that was it. So what were some of these features that were basically trying to accomplish what they were trying to get at? Well, as you mentioned, there was the Kinect motion sensor. So the Kinect had been sort of a successful part of the previous generation, and it was all chasing after what the Wii was doing with motion controls. But, again, part of what they were trying to sell with the new Kinect was that you could basically turn your console on and off by saying, Xbox, go on, turn on, or whatever, because it's listening to you at all times. That's a thing.
That's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was the announcement I remember was Xbox, play game, and it would switch to a game, and it would be Forza 5. It'd be Xbox, watch TV, and it would switch to the TV where you had a DVR-esque menu, and it was boom, and then it would be Xbox, play music, and then it was go to whatever music app, which Microsoft had their what was it, media thing for Windows? I can't remember the name of it. They had that as a native app,
right,
which no one at the time, I guess there was the Zune. Was that their thing? Microsoft Zune?
Gosh, yeah.
So I think it was the successor to that. Yeah. And so it wasn't quite like the Zune, but it was the whatever software they had. So it was pre-Spotify. It was the early stages of Pandora. It's so whatever music app they had, it was totally separate from your iTunes. And, I don't even know if Google Play was a thing at the time, but yeah, so it was Xbox Play Music, and then it would switch back to Xbox TV, and then it switched back to the TV, and the guy was see how quick it is? So of the 4 examples, only one of them was games, and it was TV twice and music once, and it was huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So, other things that they were trying to accomplish with it, they wanted to have cloud access to games and media, integration with phone and tablet devices, and technology to provide players with heads-up displays on glasses worn by the player, codenamed Fortizella. Microsoft did not comment on these reported features. That was from a leaked document from what was at the time codenamed Durango. But that's kind of what it seemed like they were going for at the time. Obviously, they unveiled it and showed a bunch of things. One of the things they did show off, or kind of 2 of the things that were really controversial when they unveiled it, were the emphasis on digital gaming to the point where the original announcement said the box was going to be a digital-only device. There was going to be no disk drive, and therefore no physical media. Games would not be coming out in physical form for the Xbox One, which presents a lot of problems nowadays, but definitely presented problems back in 2013.
Yeah, the digital storefront was not ubiquitous at all. This is not a thing. Games did not come out digitally on day one at this time. Yes, the storefronts for PSN and Xbox 360 existed, and you could spend points on games, but it was nowhere near as acceptable to buy a game digitally then as it is today.
Right.
And so that was a huge turnoff and a major, major point of antagonistic. I don't even whatever.
Yeah. Between the
contention
players,
with the general public at large, the consumers who wanted to buy games.
Right, because it was impacting industries beyond. I mean, it was impacting other businesses, right? Because secondhand games and used games were going to be severely impacted. The ability to lend games. There was this whole. They were they wanted to try to assuage players, and they had this whole presentation about how you can still lend games to your friend. Basically, you do this complicated thing where you lease them a copy, and then if it expires after 2 weeks or some blah 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 blah. And Sony was able to capitalize on that whole thing by being here's how you share games on the PlayStation 4, and they just handed them a copy of the physical copy of the game, and that's again, it was just hugely impactful. But also the used game market, GameStop hated this idea and lobbied against it at the time, basically trying to highlight and create a stronger relationship with Sony because Microsoft was trying to basically cut their business in half. So it was a big deal. It was more than just players don't like this. It was the industry was rejecting this idea at the time as a whole, despite how forward thinking it is. Because now we have all digital consoles in the form of PlayStation 5 and
Series S.
Can you get the Series S? That's right. It is all digital. So
there was a Xbox One SAD. It was the all digital version, but I think the Series S does not have a disk drive. Correct.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like it's a thing now, totally a thing, an optional thing, but it's a thing that you can pay less money for. So it was very forward thinking at the time, but it was just a big deal when they did try to do that. The other big controversial thing was this sort of always on. Well, and that wasn't necessarily announced, but it was a rumor that had circulated about it. But the whole console, in order to use the console, you'd have to have a persistent internet connection at all times, which bugs people for a lot of reasons, because, not everyone plays games online. Not everyone likes to consume and have all the interactive, connectivity online. Sometimes you just want to play a game in offline mode and not be bothered by anybody. And it seems like Microsoft was trying to force players out of that. So much contention had been drawn about this that there was a quote from a Microsoft employee on Twitter that just made things worse. He said, "Sorry, I don't get the drama about always having an always on console. Every device is always on now. That's the world we live in. # deal with it." It's like, oh, you idiot. Like you're an idiot. Like that's, you are severely misunderstanding how people consume games, why people consume games. And like, again, what he's saying now is a little bit more understandable in 2021 than it was in 2013. But in 2013, there was still this sort of general apprehension about this idea that like everything was connected to the internet and devices were watching you and listening to you at all times. Like there were still some pretty serious privacy concerns, and there still are for good reason, because like data is a huge problem in this country, and privacy is a huge problem as well. And it's all been contributed by this kind of stuff. So anyways, furthermore, there were concerns about DRM and stuff like that, but I really want to move on from this point. But that was like what happened. They announced it and unveiled it, and they basically walked back on everything. Everything that was controversial, everything that people had a problem with, they walked back on, except for maybe the Kinect, I think, was still
the Kinect eventually came. So the Kinect is one aspect of the controversy you haven't mentioned. It was the console was $500 and it came bundled with a Kinect. You had to have it. Like every Xbox One had to have a Kinect.
Right, it wasn't
and that shoehorned thing. Yeah, and the console was designed with hardware components in mind, RAM, etc., to like allow resources for this Kinect to be a part of it. And so that arguably took away hardware from video games and like their performance, etc., but also like all this extra stuff. Like not every game uses the Kinect, but there's all these features that people might not care about that you could use the Kinect for, like the voice commands. They were all done through the Kinect. And there's this thing called Snap, where you could like snap your fingers or something, and it was like a quick change, or like take a screenshot, or like take a video of something. It was this weird thing, and so like the Kinect became a controversial aspect of the Xbox One that they later removed the Kinect bundle, and they updated the hard, like a firmware update to the console itself to allow developers to allocate those resources to their games. So in some games that you would run, it would actually disable your Kinect. So if you had a launch Xbox One console connected to a Kinect, you could put in this new game with a new firmware update, and the game would run on it using resources the Kinect would have previously used. It would just disable the Kinect entirely. So then they removed it from the bundle, so you could buy a standalone Xbox One by itself with no Kinect. That's the one I have, and you can save $100. It was $100 cheaper. So it was one of the like price drop hardware revisions that they did early on in that cycle. So yeah, they definitely walked back on all of those things.
This is funny. In response to this, I just want to read this last comment here about that's here on the history section in the Wikipedia article. It says, in response to these pre-launch changes and a belief that Microsoft's initial decisions for the console were in poor judgment, journalists and consumers jokingly gave the Xbox One nicknames such as the Xbox 180 in reference to the 360, and Microsoft's decision to reverse its controversial decisions, and Xbone as another nickname, suggesting that the company was throwing a bone to consumers by making these compromises. It's like, oh man. Yeah. But really, there was so much negative. It was, again, and maybe it was an example of like the loudest voices, or like the minority is the loudest, right? The upset minority is the loudest. I don't know, but I don't think so. I think this was a genuine example. Right, exactly. I think this was a genuine example of them revealing a product and then going, oh crap, we made a mistake and we need to completely reverse course.
The broader view of the industry at this time, the Nintendo Wii was selling gangbusters, but they had just announced the Wii U, which was also a confusing flop that had convoluted marketing and discussions. Like people didn't even know the Wii U was the second console. They thought it was like an add-on to the Wii. But hot on the heels of the success that the Wii was, which is arguably Nintendo's most successful home console, so they just came out with like the Wii U, prior to the Xbox One and PS4, so they're limping out the gate.
Yep.
Microsoft unveils their Xbox One, and they have this controversy out the gate. This just like the Red Sea has been cleared for Sony to come out with the PlayStation 4 and nailed it. I mean, crushed their marketing and their messaging.
We talked about this, though. Like, if they hadn't, like, there was at the time this sort of, like, concept of how, like, is console gaming irrelevant? And like so far, again at this point up until Sony's presentation and revealing the PS4, basically one can make the argument the PS4 may have saved this generation or this past generation of console gaming, because up to this point there was this big question as to, is this irrelevant, and will PC gaming basically just overtake this, or mobile gaming over PC or mobile gaming, will those become the new primary gaming spaces, and console gaming will fade to obscurity? Thankfully, Sony came in with a nice, strong PS4, which we'll talk about in another episode, probably.
Yeah, when we go over that.
Yeah, so, but at the time, there was this, I imagine being at that E3, there was this sort of sense of being like, what the heck is console gaming doing at this point, before the PS4 presentation? So, so the console would basically last for, the last, what was it, so 7 years until 2020? When the Series X would come out?
There's a revision for the Xbox One series, the S model, which was a slim of Xbox One S that came out in 2016, and then there was the Xbox One X, the 4K capable console that came out. I don't remember exactly when that did, but with this generation of the Xbox One, they started making their moves throughout the generation, and so
they revealed them in 2016. I don't know if they released them in 2016, but that's what I'm seeing here.
Well, the S was definitely released in 2016.
So the X was in either 17
the S
or
was
18.
like a slim. It's like Xbox One Slim. So it's exactly the same hardware as the original launch Xbox One, with the ability to stream 4K video content. So it had a little bit. And then there was the Xbox One S all digital in 2020.
They finally were able to do what they wanted with the console.
Yeah, in 2020, which was 7 years later.
Yeah.
But the Xbox One X, the 4K capable console, that came out in 2017, November 7th specifically. So, the launch Xbox One console was there for 4 more years before they revised it.
All right, so let's talk about this beast. What is the Xbox One? Obviously, we could talk about. Let's just focus on the launch console, the console that was the primary thing for the last 7 years. Let's talk about that and skip the internals of the S and the X, just for simplicity's sake. But what was the Xbox One?
The CPU was a custom 8-core AMD Jaguar processor that ran at 1.75 gigahertz. Its GPU was a custom AMD GCN. I used to know what that was. At 853 megahertz. For RAM, it had 8 gigabytes of DDR3 and 32 megabytes of ES RAM, which is like ridiculously super fast RAM.
Yeah.
And then internal storage-wise, it had a 500 gigabyte model, a 1 terabyte model, and a 2 terabyte model throughout its life cycle. And then the unique feature that it had was an HDMI pass-through, which we'll talk about in a moment. To compare that to the PlayStation 4, just for like some bounds, the CPU on the PS4 was also an 8-core AMD Jaguar, but it was running at 1.6 gigahertz, so a 0.15 difference slower. That means the Xbox is a little bit more powerful. The PlayStation also had a custom AMD Radeon GCN that ran at 800 megahertz, whereas the Xbox ran at 853 megahertz. So on paper, the Xbox One is actually faster in both its CPU and GPU. And then for RAM, they both had 8 gigabytes of DDR3, but the Xbox was the one that had the extra 32 megabytes, which is not very much, of the ES RAM that's ultra fast, whereas the PlayStation 4 did not. So on paper, the Xbox One's better.
Yeah, these are numbers that actually, like, when we do these still on the consoles, I always love this section with older consoles, because it's like, wow, like, we're talking megabytes, we're talking like just the low end of like computing power. When you look at consoles from 20 or 30 years ago, it's now fun on the other end of the spectrum here to be like, yeah, those are respectable numbers, and those aren't going to be respectable numbers in like 10 years, but right now it's like, okay, yeah, that's a decent box. Like, you could do some good stuff on that box.
Yeah.
It's like you could play some good games on that box. And maybe that's, again, like, being someone who's been out of PC gaming for a while, like those are still respectable numbers that may not be now these days, but still,
apparently the Jaguar CPU is really, really limiting for things, like really, really limiting. So the architecture has changed a lot since then. That's like the biggest limiting reagent, I think, that I've heard through like Digital Foundry's hardware analysis. One other aspect of the hardware that I want to talk about with the Xbox One specifically was that Xbox was recovering from the massive $1 billion deficit that was created during the 360 era of the Red Ring of Death.
Yeah,
it cost them, I think it is billions. I should quote an actual statement just to make sure. I'm going to Google the Xbox 360 Red Ring of Death cost overall. It was astronomical, but the hardware, it was $1.15 billion. The entire Red Ring cost Microsoft that much money. And Xbox head explained why and other stuff. We're not going to go there. But what's cool about this hardware with the Xbox One is they've learned their lesson by far. And so they use this massive cooling fan to avoid the overheating problem. So if you've seen the original console, it looks like a giant VCR, but the whole right side, like, more than a quarter of the console's space is a massive fan on the top. So like, and it's got this massive heatsink and it's attached directly to the processor. Like they're not playing at all with the cooling solution that they have.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, the other kind of thing, just since we're talking about the physicality of these boxes, like I feel like this generation is where both console manufacturers stopped caring about the size of the box itself. Like, both the Xbox One and the PS4 were fairly big, the launch models, and they wouldn't kind of, again, see the smaller versions that many people are probably familiar with. I feel like those are more widely available, in hindsight, than the launch models. But like those launch models in both cases were sizable beasts, and it's just kind of funny because like there was such a big back and forth that Sony and Microsoft were having, and again, Sony fans and Microsoft fans, were like, I think it was the PS2 was nice and slim, but the Xbox was huge, and so Sony gamers were like, "Ew, your Microsoft thing is big, fat, and ugly." Then the 360 came out, and it was like a little slimmer and smaller, and tighter or whatever, and then the PS3 was a little bit bigger than it, and so of course then the tables were turned, and Microsoft fans, Xbox fans were like, "Ew, your PS3 is so big," and then finally this generation was like, no, they stopped caring about that battle. That battle was, and now you've got the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, and they're bigger than all the consoles. Like they're the biggest ones yet. They're huge. So I think that people are like, they just it's like that was a battle that just sort of both manufacturers like, nope, we don't care anymore. So
cool. And it's a matter of like cooling and performance, because a lot of this like the technology has evolved in such a way that like there's equations that need to be made that execute, and Mark Cerny does a way better job of explaining this with the PlayStation 5, but there's like boost clocks and thermals that happen, and then there's noise values of fans, and there's all this stuff that they take into experience when it comes to energy savings, because they don't just create something that runs the same speed all the time. The actual gigahertz of the processors vary over time based on like game demand and temperature, and so like the cooling system is related to the performance you get, and it's a whole thing. So like that's why I think that they don't really care about the size of the consoles anymore. It's all about energy efficiency and cooling, and so you have to have a lot of space to take care of those things.
I mean,
this is the beginning of that.
I think the average gamer doesn't. The gamers themselves don't care about the size or even really the look of the boxes. I say that very, very broadly because I'm sure there are gamers out there who have an appreciation for aesthetic taste and have opinions on that, but I'm just sort of speaking in broad terms. The problem is that gamers don't live in a vacuum. They usually live with people, and in most cases, I think those people aren't necessarily gamers themselves. So I definitely sympathize with the idea. I mean, I sympathize as someone who's experienced it. Like, my wife does not love the look of the PlayStation 5, nor its placement. Necessary placement
because of how big it is,
of how big and ugly it is, and yes, I said ugly. It's and I would agree with her. It's not a timeless looking machine. It's going to look...
I disagree, man. I love that thing. It's fantastic.
It's going to look stupid in like 5 years when general aesthetic tastes have changed. That thing's going to look real freaking stupid in about 2 to 8 years for sure. All that's just to say, like, I do understand, how how non-gamers might be like, that box is big and ugly and stupid, but gamers themselves, I think, are agree. It's like function over form in this case. So, cool. Let's talk about the controller. What was different, or how did they iterate or change the controller or innovate? And what are your thoughts on the changes they made?
They didn't make a whole lot of changes on the controller. They did replace the start and back buttons on the 360 with a new menu and view buttons. The menu button is located on the right. It pulls up, quote, context-specific menus, which game and app developers can design to enhance the user experience. Microsoft told that to IGN. It can be used by game developers to bring up in-game menus and show playback options or accessing commands on the console's user interface. The replacement for the back button, the view button located on the left side, is a developer program button that will change views or provide more information in games and apps. It can be used, for example, in a role-playing game to pull up a map, or a first-person shooter to pull up a leaderboard. So that's basically it. It does look like they invested $100 million into the controller itself, which is a lot of money, coming off the success of the 360 controller that some people argue is still the best controller ever made today.
There's a good argument to be made for that. Yeah,
there is, yeah. And this is the logical succession to that. So this Xbox One controller is very much unchanged in the Series XS version versus the original Xbox One. There was some later modifications to like how there was a 3.5 millimeter audio jack added to a later revision. There was changes to Bluetooth technology. It was added in later with the Xbox One S, allowing the controllers to connect wirelessly over Bluetooth versus like their proprietary connection medium that they used on the 360. So there's other things like that, but nothing really groundbreaking or earth-shattering. They didn't do the motion stuff that like PlayStation was doing with the DualShock 4 or the Switch was doing with its Joy-Cons at the time. So,
well, a little bit later down the road. Well, they also and the thing that's one of the sort of big notable things here is that they failed to iterate on the battery. You still had a battery pack. You still had to run the whole thing off of AA batteries, which isn't the end of the world. They still
do, even with the Series S.
Exactly. It's not the end of the world, but certainly at this point, chargeable devices like that seem to be the preference of most consumers in general. Again, this is one of those things that sort of, in general, people don't like having to replace batteries. Literally go physically drag a battery out of a drawer somewhere and jam it into their controller. No, they'd much rather just plug it in where all of their other devices plug into. So, yeah, whatever. So that's the thing. They had the Elite controller where it had some customization. You could add buttons and stuff like that to it, which is kind of cool at the time. But cool. The only other thing that I want to mention is the Kinect, and though one could argue that was an attachment, accessory, or whatever, it was kind of both at the time. Like what they were trying to do with the Kinect was to add more input options. Therefore, it's part of the control of the device, and therefore, arguably, a controller in and of itself. So being able to power the thing on and off using your voice, whether we can argue, we could spend a whole episode arguing whether the Kinect was a success or not, but what they're trying to do with it was to evolve game control options, and so definitely was innovative at the time, and would even be considered innovative now if they had been able to stick the landing or had thought through a little bit more of its implementation a little bit better than that. So yeah, those are some things. Any other thoughts on the Kinect before we move on?
Yeah, the Kinect was like the successor to the 360 one. So it had a higher resolution camera, it had a higher frame rate. It was supposed to like pick up more nuanced movements, and it just be this way more innovative camera. And it actually had a lot of applications outside of gaming, specifically to the Xbox. Like other companies were taking the Kinect and hooking it up to their Windows machines and customizing drivers and doing lots of cool things that involved a lot of AR, like augmented reality, almost like virtual reality, where you could like reach into spaces and like adjust and tweak things, kind of like Iron Man, like, the whole, or what's there's a Tom Cruise movie that I'm blanking on right now that had like the Minority Report, where you had like these movable screens and stuff. So like the Kinect was super, actually like way better than what it was. But for the context of Xbox and in gaming, it was a flop because no one in gaming really wanted it. But it had a lot of cool technology that was very useful in other industries as well. So it's worth noting that the Kinect was actually very innovative in what they were trying to accomplish. So, yeah. And it is a controller, so there you go.
Cool. Well, let's move on to games real quick. We don't have a lot of time to spend here, so let's just sort of hit it. So what were some of the sort of games that were definitive to the console? I mean, there was a lot of third-party games, so many of the third-party games that were successful over the last generation were successful on the Xbox One. But let's focus on exclusive games because, again, what set the Xbox apart from, a game standpoint. So you had so you obviously had your Halo, your Gears of War, You had so they had Sea of Thieves as sort of a console exclusive, which is pretty cool. Ori Will of the Wisps, and The Ascent. And I see the Sunset Overdrive here as a must-have Xbox exclusive game, or a list of the 10 best Xbox exclusive games. So, any other games you think that were sort of definitive for that?
Yes, there was Forza Horizon 3 and 4 were absolutely. I'm still playing Forza Horizon 4 even now on a Series X because they enhanced it for that. But Forza Horizon 4 is awesome, open world, online, connected racing. Yeah, Ori and the Will of the Wisps you mentioned, and its sequel were absolutely incredible. They were completely developed and designed in remote workspaces before COVID, like back in the late 2010. So like absolutely astronomically beautiful, amazing platformers. Cuphead, you can't forget about that. Like lovely indie game darling that came out on Xbox.
Yeah, I forgot
you
about
mentioned Halo,
Quantum Break too. Quantum Break from Remedy. So that was I forgot that was Xbox exclusive, and I believe Alan Wake was as well.
Alan Wake was an exclusive to 360.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, 360. Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool.
Then you mentioned Halo, but not just Halo in general, but the Master Chief Collection specifically.
Yeah.
While it came out with a lot of problems, especially their online stuff, they fixed it and shaped it into something absolutely incredible. Yeah. I have it on Steam. They've now added ODST and Reach to it, and then of course there's Halo 5. So pretty much the entirety of Halo you can experience on the Xbox One. In a much better fashion. Like they had the graphics switcher where you could switch between the original graphics and like the new one. It was really, really cool. I also want to highlight Rise of the Tomb Raider, which had an Xbox One timed exclusivity for over a year before it ever came to PlayStation.
Wow.
And it really showcased the hardware of Xbox One. And one of its launch titles was, I think it was called Rise, something to Rome.
Oh yeah, Son of Rome, Rise Son of Rome.
Son of Rome, yeah. And that was actually like a good showcase of what the next generation of graphics could do and gameplay. Third-person action-adventure hack and slash, developed by Crytek. So gorgeous game. So there's some definitive games there. I mean, Xbox One had its moment.
Like a little bit underwhelming though. Like none of those games I'm sitting there being like, oh my gosh, amazing. They're all fun and good games, but like compared to we'll get around to the PS4 at some point, I'm sure, and talking about those games is gonna be a hard section to keep tight for us because there are some just incredible experiences on the PS4. So.
Yep.
All right, cool. Then let's. I'm happy to move on. We don't have a lot of time left, so let's skip the attachments. I mean, we talked a little bit about the Kinect, so let's talk about the impact and legacy. What is the Xbox One's legacy? What is its sort of impact on the gaming industry?
If you have any interest in anything Xbox related today, it's because of the impact of how bad the Xbox One flopped when it first was announced. It really set them back. They never talked about sales figures. They've always been chasing the tails of Sony through the entire generation of Xbox One and PS4, and they're still catching up to the PS5, although they've made leaps and bounds changes. Backwards compatibility was not even a thing for the Xbox One. Like all of the 360 library was cut off, much like the PS4 was cut off from its PS3 legacy. So the fact that they've now went back and grabbed OG Xbox games and a lot of Xbox 360 titles, they have completely reversed on all of that. Everything has a disc drive. You can buy everything on disc now. You can trade them all in, etc. Hand them to your friends. Game Pass in and of itself is a direct impact. Like that's probably the giant, like a massive crater in the gaming industry right now, and everything else is just in its wake because it's revolutionary. There's nothing else out there that's like it. It's literally the best deal in games, hands down. Day and date, day one, new Xbox titles are coming to the subscription service that is cheap compared to the spending of $60 or $70 for new games. And so the fact that we have Game Pass now is the impact and legacy of the flop of what was the Xbox One. We're seeing the fruits of what Microsoft has put in. Phil Spencer being at the head of Xbox now, that was a move done in the middle of the Xbox One generation, and he has completely turned it around. We see Microsoft acquiring 12 studios, stuff like Ninja Theory, and I will blank on all of them unless I have a list in front of me, but the fact that they have all these exclusive titles, we are going to see an Xbox unlike anything we've ever seen in this generation and moving through this generation. Like the Xbox Series X and S right now are going to dominate and crush a lot of the conversation and a lot of the announcements over the next couple of years in our gaming events. And it's going to be like, boom, Sony goes out and everyone loses their mind. And then boom, Xbox comes out and everyone loses their mind. It's going to be lit and extremely exciting and awesome. And it's a wonderful time to be a gamer now, especially if you care at all about consoles. But the Microsoft, the powerhouse that we have today, is literally the result of the massive failure of what the Xbox One was in its time. And I think that is the impact and legacy.
Sure. It's interesting to see how they've sort of traded places as, the darlings over the years. I mean, no one can argue that Sony was the darling of the last generation, but Microsoft was the darling of the previous generation. And now if you listen to game journalists and if you listen to sort of, the average player, people who maybe not be quite as much fanboys and stuff like that, you see a lot of like appreciation for what Microsoft's doing this generation over what Sony's doing. And you can see a lot of sort of general criticism of Sony, and maybe it's because they're on top, so maybe it's the sort of like they're the ones that need to be taken down a peg or whatever, but you definitely see a lot of criticism over Sony's business practices and a lot of praise over Microsoft's business practices this generation, even if the sales of the PlayStation are still outstripping the Xbox, month to month. There's two thoughts I have, though, real quick about, we don't want to talk about this gen, we want to talk about last gen, and there are two thoughts I have about the Xbox One in regards to its impact. And the first one is that this was, I think, the very first console that was really, really designed in the age of the internet for the internet, if that makes sense. So this was a console that was designed with the internet trends in mind, more so than any other console. And what I mean by that is like, it was like, again, what they were trying to do with the whole all-in-one thing, down to its, the console's name. What they decide to name the console means a lot. It's important. That's why Sony keeps it simple with the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's meant to give you a sense of progression that each one's better than the next, while still being vague enough that they can, change its features and designs over the years. Nevertheless, naming it the Xbox One as, meant to signify this all-in-one thing really speaks to the design of it, because that was the trend at the time, internet-wise. And I get the impression the Xbox 360 was like, with its internet capabilities, was like, oh, hey, how can we do gaming online? Whereas the Xbox One was the opposite of that. It was, how can we do the internet on a game console, right? So they were really internet focused and internet trend focused to a fault, exactly, with the original design of this console. But then that leads me to my second point in regards to their impact, which is, as much as they made mistakes, as much as they significantly miscalculated and misunderstood what users wanted out of the experience, I still see shades of current Microsoft there, in the sense that they were really still trying to focus on the user experience. They missed the mark and they misunderstood, but they were really everything about the Xbox One screams to me of like they were trying to craft a user experience. They were trying to craft an experience for the player that was unlike what their competitor was even conceptualizing. And as much as that flopped in 2013, with the help of and the direction of, minds like Phil Spencer and some time and iteration, I really think that that's shining through now in the best possible ways with the Xbox Series X and what Microsoft is doing in that space in regards to just trying to like really, really make consumer focused decisions with their platform, as opposed to just game focused decisions. And there's nothing wrong with, game focused decisions. It's a gaming console after all. Like I don't necessarily completely criticize Sony's approach in that sort of contrast there, but I do think that like Microsoft is really trying hard, and I appreciate the efforts they've made over the years to prioritize the experience, the quality of life of what does it mean to interact with this thing, not just play games on it. So cool. All right. Well, any other thoughts? Closing thoughts there in response to what I said?
Just know that the PlayStation 3 eventually did outpace the 360 and outsold it, and it did end up supreme in that generation. So Sony has dominated the PS2, the PS3, the PS4, and now the PS5 era.
You bring it up every single time I mention.
I do. Like, you have to remember it. Like,
I know it.
It's weird to me, even. And the reason why I keep bringing this up is because in my own experience and in my own memory, I was a 360 kid. Yeah. And like everyone I was around was 360 kids. Everyone in college, everyone I worked with, all of my coworkers, all of my friends, everyone had Xbox. Like that was it. Like no one I knew had a PS3 except for like one person I ever can remember. And so it's easy for me to fall into the Xbox 360 was the darling of that generation. But they were for the first half, but the Red Ring of Death gimped them much.
It did, yeah.
That like Sony was able to change their strategy in games focus, where you got Infamous 1 and 2 and Resistance 1, 2, and 3 and Killzone and Ratchet and Clank and all these wonderful like first-party Sony games that came out in the latter half of the PlayStation 3 lifecycle that they came back and ate Xbox 360's lunch when they were recovering from Red Ring of Death. And so now we see like the Xbox One come out with a mixed message. You cannot come out with a new idea and tell consumers to go do this new stuff. It's way more lucrative to meet the consumers where they are and get them doing, like, meet them in their space. So that's what Sony did with the PS4. They're like, oh, you want to play games on this console? We're going to come out with games, and we're just going to we're going to put this thing right where you exist. Where Xbox, where Microsoft was trying to do with the Xbox One was like, here's all this new stuff that consoles have never done before that we would really love for you guys to start doing.
Sure. Well, like, I mean, but the funny thing is that's what the stuff that the vast majority of people are doing now. Like the irony of the Xbox One, the ultimate tragedy, I think, of the Xbox One is it was a console before its time, but just barely, just barely before its time. Like
just
Microsoft
barely.
Microsoft, as much as I say, like, Microsoft came across as out of touch with what users wanted, but the truth is Microsoft was trying to tell us what they knew we wanted. We just didn't know we wanted it yet.
Exactly.
And they got a lot of bad press for it, but the reality is they were just before their time. And I agree, had they been a little bit more focused on the here and now at the time, then they might have been able to turn things around. But because of what we see now, where it's like they have really learned from that mistake, and yet at the same time, what they're doing with the Xbox now is, once again, they're telling us what we want before we want it. Like, and the best example of that now is the whole cloud gaming. Like, you can try before you buy, or try while it's downloading. Like, that whole thing is amazing, and it's all because, like, they're telling us, like, you know, they're using technology. They're doing what tech companies should do, which is using technology to present us with a need that we thought that we didn't even think we had. But then once we're presented with it, it's like, okay, I can't live without this. So that's like,
now they're doing it smartly in ways to enhance the current existing hardware with free updates. It's all free. You know, it doesn't cost it. Okay, cloud gaming's coming out. You can try before you buy. It's instant. You don't have to install it, but it doesn't cost anything. I don't have to do anything. I just get that. Whereas, like, with the Xbox One's announcement, it was like, here's all this new stuff. Oh, and it's a $500 console. So you're like, oh, I don't want the Kinect. Well, too bad. I don't want the DVR features. I don't need an HDMI pass-through. Oh, too bad. Like, you get that. It's $500.
Yeah. So, I mean, for better or for worse, there are some pitfalls that I think about Microsoft's strategy as an organization beyond the Xbox, and things like the whole, like, I don't know if you're, like, Windows 11 is massively
October
controversial, 4th. And and they're trying to roll out features that a lot of people are still bucking up against. The one that bothers me is they're really pushing the whole Microsoft account thing. You have to have a Microsoft account, no more local accounts. Like, that bothers me as an administrator of computers. Is like, no, let me make a local account on there, because like, for many reasons, but also the whole like, have you heard the whole passwordless thing they're doing now? You can granted you can opt into it, but like, they're making it so that you don't put in a password to log into your Microsoft account. You can opt in to basically, like, get rid of your password altogether and just log in using a notification on your phone. So basically, you know, you click, I want to log in, instead of enter a password, it's, hey, we've sent a notification to your phone. Click accept to log it in or whatever. And so, like,
oh, that's all well and good until someone can spoof your phone,
or your phone is lost, or your phone is, or you accidentally factory reset your phone or delete your authenticator app, whatever. Like, whoops.
It's fine. In 7 years, this will be ubiquitous.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Is like, it's like, on the one hand, it's like, stop telling me what you think I want, but at the same time, I accept that, like, yeah, that's actually some quality of life stuff. It's very forward thinking, but it's totally Microsoft. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how, like, Microsoft has always been trying to drag their user base by their heels into the future, and we always eventually are like, yeah, they were probably right about that. But all right, cool, awesome. Well, that is the Xbox One, ladies and gentlemen. We want to hear your thoughts on the Xbox One, but also we want to hear your thoughts on the entire soul of the console series for this manufacturer. So you can go back and talk everything about the Xbox through the Xbox One. We want to hear all those thoughts. We want to hear if you had an Xbox, what were your thoughts on it as a user, or if you're a PlayStation person, or if you're a PC gamer, what do you think about this console and all of its crazy successes and failures? We want to hear those thoughts and more. Termite, where can they share those thoughts if they have them?
I want to know, if you had an Xbox One, did you buy one at launch? Did you buy into the hype? Did you ignore all of the things that were happening at the time and just like, you know what, I need this Xbox, I'm going to get it? I want to know about that. Mm-hmm. And you can let me know if you did that at 80bitpodsmash.com. It's our landing website where links to all of our social media outlets, Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where you can start your own conversation on any of those platforms. Tell me all about your experience with the Xbox One. We also have a Discord server. The links are in the show notes of every episode that we post. You can find that. And if you are listening by way of YouTube and you want to know where else you can find our podcast, we have our podcast platforms as well: Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. We are everywhere: Google Play, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you want us to be. Our RSS feed is there. You can throw it into any third-party app on your phone or device of your choice. If we don't exist somewhere you want us to be, then let us know, and we'll put ourselves there just for you. So let us know in those comments that we just talked about how you can talk to us on social media.
Mm-hmm. All right, next week, September 20th, we're getting super positive, and we're going to be talking about times and examples and stories of games having a positive real-world impact. So, you know, a game or culture around a game or a community getting together and making a difference in the real world that all centers around a game inspiring people to do so. There's one particular example that inspired the episode, and we'll talk about it then, though, so we'll tease you there, and we will see you then.
See you next week!